Hey guys, it's Krista Watson here from Christa Quilts, and I'm excited to show you how to make my charming chevrons quilt shown behind me. Now last time I showed you a tutorial, I showed you how to make the charming chevrons quilt in the smaller size made from the 5-inch pre-cut squares. This time around, I'm going to show you the very same thing with a different layout and a larger size using 10-inch squares. I'm using my Good Vibes fabric collection because it has exactly the same number of lights and darks. But of course, you can use any fabrics you choose. Just be sure to hop on over to my store to grab the pattern and the fabric, and you can have fun following along. Or you can watch the rest of this tutorial just for the machine quilting tips and tricks and apply that to any quilt in your UFO pile. So this large quilt seen behind me usually lives on my guest bed, which is a double size, and it actually fits quite nicely. But in the pattern, you can choose from 4 different sizes. And the best thing is, I include 2 different quilting plans on how to quilt it. This time around, I'm going to show you how to do the quilting exactly as you see here, and I'm going to break down the process for you step by step. Now this quilt is quilted to death because that's just how I like it. But there's no problems quilting your quilts densely just like I do, as long as you follow my tried and true techniques. The secret is to use natural fiber materials. Wash your quilt, use your quilt, snuggle it, and love it. The best thing is, the quilts are going to soften up the more you use them. To make the blocks, you'll pair up light and dark squares, mark a line down the middle, and sew on either side of the line. Each pair of squares will make 2 half-square triangles. Lay out your blocks according to one of the layouts in the pattern. I like to put them on my design wall and then take a picture of to refer to it as I sew. I get best results when sewing with a shorter stitch length and pressing all of my seams open. Then I'll sew all the way around the edges to keep the edge seams from splitting open while handling. So my favorite batting that I love to use is Hobbs Tuscany Cotton and Wool. It's the best of both worlds. The wool batting doesn't show any wrinkles, and the cotton batting is very soft and drapey, and together they make a winning combination. Now, contrary to popular belief, quilting your quilts to death will not make them stiff and wiry as long as you use natural fiber materials. Cotton thread, cotton or wool batting, cotton fabrics are a really good combination. It's only when you put synthetic materials that aren't breathable, such as polyester, plastic, nylon, those types of things, that's what makes your quilt stiff, not the quilting. So stick with cotton materials, natural materials, and you're not going to have any issues while quilting. I use batting shears to trim my batting so that it's only a few inches larger than my quilt top. To baste my quilts, I'll use 505 basting spray and spray it on the wrong side of my quilt backing on a table outside. Then I'll also spray the wrong side of the quilt top. I'll fold these up and take them inside to assemble on my design wall. I'll put a few pins at the top of my backing and let gravity pull the weight down until it's nice and smooth. I'll use a longer ruler to help smooth out each layer as I go. I'll add the quilt top in the same way. It starts out as a scrunched up mess, but I'll smooth it all out, making sure that there's extra batting and backing sticking around on all 4 sides. The final step is to iron the quilt on both sides to set the glue and smush everything together. So that's a quick overview of my basting process. Once you have every single inch of the quilt sticking to every other inch of the quilt, it's not going to shift, and it's going to make the machine quilting process so much easier. Now, if you don't have a design wall, that's okay. You can still do this spray basting process entirely on a table. All you would do is lay out the layers as I've shown you, but move them around and work on the middle sections and then the side sections. You can still use the ruler to smush it all out and make it nice and square, and you can also bring it inside to iron it to set the glue. Be sure to check out some of my other tutorials to see how to build the design wall behind me and how to baste your quilt on a table rather than on a wall. So before I start to machine quilt, I always make a quilting plan. Even if I don't stick exactly to the plan, it's a guide map to show me how I'm going to quilt the quilt and break down the process and which designs that I'm going to use. Here's my quilting plan for the large Charming Chevrons quilt. I'll begin by stitching in the ditch in between each row of blocks. I'll follow the zigzag outline and use a walking foot or dual feed system. I'll start on the right-hand side of the quilt and stitch each row from the top of the quilt to the bottom, cutting thread and starting again at the top of the next row. When I reach the center of the quilt, I'll rotate it and start at the top again from my perspective. I'm starting and ending each line of quilting in the batting so I don't have to bury any thread tails. The extra will all get trimmed away before binding. Next, I'll follow the same pathway, but this time I'll free motion quilt a series of textured wavy lines in the background areas. These are not marked in any way, and I'll focus on one area at a time, working my way from the top to bottom in each row. Once I've quilted about half of the quilt again with this design, I'll rotate the quilt and continue the design from the middle where I left off back over to the right-hand side again. Finally, I'll quilt a fun loopy design in the block areas of the quilt. I'm just using a different design, but the stitching pathway is basically the same. I divide the work and conquer it one stitch at a time. So here's some video of me quilting at actual real-time speed. I'm stitching in the ditch to anchor or secure my quilt in between each row of blocks, so the area that I've quilted is not going anywhere. I'm using my built-in Bernina dual feed along with an open toe embroidery foot, the 20D, so I can see what I'm doing. You can also use a walking foot instead. I've reduced my presser foot pressure to 0, which helps reduce the chance that I'm going to get puckers on my quilt, especially when I rotate it. Notice how often I stop and readjust the quilt to keep it sliding smoothly through the machine. Now I'll speed things up so you can see more of my quilting technique. My seams have been pressed open and you can see that I'm not having any issues staying right in the ditch. Contrary to popular myth, this will not weaken your seams as long as you use a thin needle and a thin thread that makes a small hole. In fact, it's going to strengthen the quilt because I'm actually laying down extra stitches to hold everything together. The gloves I'm wearing help me grip the quilt because they have little dots at the fingertips. This helps me push it smoothly through the machine. I want the quilt to glide smoothly under the machine so that my stitches will remain even. I've increased my stitch length from the default setting of 2.5 and I've turned it up to 3.0. This will elongate my stitches slightly to compensate for any friction or drag on the quilt. This is really just a matter of personal preference, and you can make yours shorter or longer as desired. My feed dogs are up or engaged, just like for regular sewing. I'm quilting with a size 80-12 top stitch needle, and I'm using some of my 50 weight Aurifil threads for my Piece and Quilt Colors collection. Whenever I start to feel like I'm reaching, I'll adjust my hand position so that I'm always forming a hoop with my hands and quilting just the distance inside between my fingers. This helps keep everything smooth and flat while stitching. I've set my needle to stop in the down position so that each time I need to rotate the quilt, the needle will stay in the quilt. Here's a wider view where you can see me scrunching, smushing, and rotating the quilt as I go. My machine is a Bernina 770 QE with 10 inches of space underneath the arm of the machine. If you're in the market for a new machine, I highly recommend purchasing one with the widest throat space that you can afford. However, it's not absolutely necessary. I actually quilted for years and years with only 6 inches of space on a tiny machine with no issues. It's just a lot more scrunching and smushing of the quilt. I'm stitching in the ditches between each of the rows of blocks that form the zigzag design. Think of this as like outlining the edges of a coloring page. It keeps the whole quilt secure so that you can add more quilting inside those boundaries later. I call this the first pass across the quilt, and I'll rotate the entire quilt when it gets too bulky under the machine. It's a lot easier for me to start on the right-hand side of the quilt and work my way towards the center, then rotate the quilt and work my way from the center back over to the other side again. Now, if you start quilting in the middle, all that means is you have to shove half of the quilt under the machine before you even start, and that can feel very overwhelming and very stressful. So instead, if you start quilting on one side, you only have a little bit of quilt under the machine, and you gradually increase the bulk as you quilt your way across the quilt and as you gain more confidence, so it's much easier to deal with. But remember, everything I'm sharing here is just a suggestion. The most important thing is for you to do what feels most comfortable for you. I'm stitching each line of quilting from the top of the quilt to the bottom of the quilt in the batting. I prefer quilting edge-to-edge designs so that I don't have to start and stop and tie off my threads. Just be sure to check your bobbin at the end of a row of quilting when it starts to get low. You don't want to play bobbin chicken and lose right in the middle of your quilt. So here's what it looks like when I'm free motion quilting that wavy line texture. I can quilt a vertical row continuously by meandering my way around the space I'm stitching and then into the next area below. I'll work my way methodically across the quilt from the right to the left. I'm starting on the right-hand side of the quilt, and I'm going to be stitching this in all the light or low volume background areas. I start stitching at the upper right, and I'm watching out to make sure that I don't stitch off the edges. I can use my hand to help hold down those edges so my foot doesn't accidentally slide in between the quilt layers. I'm gently quilting a wavy line back and forth, kind of irregular so that none of it looks exact same. And I'm not worrying too much about what this exact design looks like. It's more important just to fill in all the areas with texture. Right now I'm stitching at actual speed, but I'll go ahead and speed this up for you so you can watch me cover more area of the quilt. If you'd like an estimate of how long it'll take you to quilt, just time yourself while you're quilting one block and then multiply that by the total number of blocks in your quilt. This wavy line design is actually very fast, fun, and forgiving to stitch, which is what I love. If you'd like to see a diagram of how I formed this design, as well as dozens of other textures that you can try, be sure to grab a copy of my book, 99 Machine Quilting Designs. I'll continue stitching this entire row of background, filling it in with this meandering wavy line design until all of the areas are filled. One of the reasons I quilt so densely is so that you won't see my imperfections. One line of quilting will stand out like a sore thumb. But once you surround your imperfect quilting with more imperfect quilting, it all blends together and you can't even see any wobbles or bobbles. Here's a still shot of what it looks like while I've got about half the quilt under the machine. I'll continue quilting methodically, filling in each background section as I go. Once I get to about the middle of the quilt, I'll stitch off the bottom edge, rotate the quilt, and then continue working my way from the center back to the right. Here's an over-the-shoulder shot where you can see more of the quilt and what it looks like while I'm shoving the quilt through the machine again. I've rotated the quilt and now I'm working my way back over to the other side. Now I'm using my older table that I've had for a long time before I got my brand new Christa cabinet that I helped design with Arrow. So there's not quite as much room to hold up the weight of the quilt, but it still works. However, because this is a large quilt, you're going to notice that it's going to fall off the back of the table and maybe off the sides. I've solved that problem with my new accessory called Christa's Quilt Blocks, which are like guardrails to help prevent this exact thing from happening. In my future videos, you'll get to see them in action. Now here's me quilting from the other angle. You can see I've quilted most of the wavy line design off to my left. I'm finishing up the last row of unquilted area to my right underneath the machine. Because this was filmed a few months ago on my older table, you can see that small wooden TV tray that I've set up on the back of my table to help catch it. And here's a sneak peek of underneath the quilt where I added another table to help hold up the weight of the quilt. This setup basically forms an L in front of me and off to my left. The wavy line design is one of my go-to motifs when I'm in a hurry. And now I'm ready for the last part of the design. For this last pass of quilting in the darker colorful prints, I'm stitching a fun spiral and loop design. I'm stitching a circular spiral design, but then cutting through the center of each shape to form the next one to keep the design continuous. This is one of those designs that I sort of made up as I went along, and you can totally do that too. Like I always say, aim for texture over perfection, and then fill in all the spaces to create depth and interest in your quilt. Here's another wide shot of me quilting so that you can see how I handle all that bulk as I quilt, because this is a pretty big quilt. Having that drop-in table makes such a huge difference when dealing with the weight and bulk of the quilt. I'll continue quilting the same design, moving smoothly across the quilt, stitching one section at a time. If I need to stop for the day or change my bobbin while quilting, I'll try to start and stop in a seam so that it's much less noticeable. Free motion quilting is all about finding a rhythm and letting go of perfection. Aim for a smooth, fluid movement while you stitch. And just remember, the best way to hide imperfect quilting is to surround it with more imperfect quilting. Here's a close-up of those loopy spirals and what they look like. Aren't they yummy? Remember to divide and conquer your quilting so it's not so overwhelming. Just remember, you're going to get better with each and every quilt you make, so dive in and give it a try, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. After all, the way we learn is just to keep on going and make quilt after quilt, and it sure is fun experimenting. Now it's time to bind my quilt, and then it's going to be all snuggly and ready for use. To bind my quilt, first I'll trim off all the excess batting and backing all the way around the edges. Then I'll cut my strips 2 inches wide and join the wrong sides together with a diagonal seam. This will ensure that my binding finishes exactly 1/4 inch on both sides. I'll trim off one angled end and press the entire binding wrong sides together along the length. I'll start stitching away from a corner and leave several inches unstitched at one end. This is my starting tail. I'm sewing it on with a 1/4 inch seam using my Bernina dual feed and the 37D foot. This is one of the reasons I prefer the dual feed to the walking foot, because I can use different feet for different applications. When I get close to the corner, I'll make a crease and stop stitching a 1/4 inch away from the end. Then I'll stitch off the corner. I remove my quilt from the machine and make a fold to take care of that excess fabric in the corners. Be sure to stop and re-watch this part a few times until you get the hang of it. I'll start stitching at the corner again, making sure that the thread doesn't get all knotted up in the corner. Then I'll continue stitching down the next side of the quilt. Folding the corners like this will automatically create the miter on the front of the quilt. And then when it's time to secure the binding on the back of the quilt, you'll be able to fold the corners to create a miter on the back as well. Continue stitching all the way around the quilt, leaving a bit of ending tail unstitched. Here's how to make that hidden seam at the end. Trim off any excess and lay the ending tail flat open on top of the quilt. Then lay down the starting tail, open it up, and then mark that angle with a pencil or washable marker. You're marking right along the edge of the angle on the starting tail, but you're making the mark on the ending side of the tail. Add 1/2 inch to this mark to account for seam allowances on both ends of the binding. Then trim it off at a 45-degree angle. Join the angled ends by offsetting them about a 1/4 inch and pin generously. Make sure you don't have any twisted tails when you join them together. Then sew the ends together with a 1/4 inch seam and finger press those seams open. Cut off those extra triangle tips and close the binding wrong sides together again. Pin the unsewn binding to the quilt to ensure you won't have any puckers or pleats when you sew it onto your quilt. Stitch the opening closed and test it to be sure that when you flip it over to the back side, it will cover up the original stitching. Now you can hand or machine sew it to finish. I actually prefer to hand sew because I like the nice clean look of those hidden stitches. Plus, it gives me a chance to cuddle up with the quilt and enjoy some relaxing hand sewing. I usually stitch with the quilt out in front of me and stitching from right to left. I'll grab a bit of the backing and a bit of the fold with each stitch and then pull it tight. I'll knot it off when needed and cut off a new length of thread. It usually takes me about an hour per side to hand stitch it. Now, if you'd like to see a tutorial for machine binding instead, be sure to check out my other videos. Now here are some finished images of my charming Chevrons quilt. Didn't it turn out beautifully? So what do you think of this charming Chevrons quilt? Would you like to make one now? It goes together very quickly, so it gives you plenty of time for the machine quilting, and that doesn't take very long either. And besides, it's a great way to practice your free motion quilting skills. Be sure to pick up a copy of the charming Chevrons quilt pattern, as well as 5-inch or 10-inch squares, depending on which side you want to make, and you can get all those supplies at shop.christaquilts.com. Be sure to leave a comment and let me know how you like this quilt and also what questions you have about this pattern and about quilting in general. I'm here to cheer you on every step of the way and make the process fun and less intimidating. Until next time, happy quilting!